The archivist noticed the smell first. Not a transmission, not a weapon's signature, not any of the 1,000 catastrophic signals her instruments were calibrated to detect across 17 star systems. Just a smell, or the closest analog her sensory apparatus could translate, bleeding through the atmospheric sample collector mounted on the hull of survey vessel Unyielding Patience Asterisk. Something organic, complex, faintly metallic and warm in a way that carbon-rich atmospheres rarely produced, without biological contamination. She checked the source coordinates. Sector 07, the erased sector. Her manipulator limbs went still above the console. The instruments continued their patient scroll of data, temperature gradients, spectral readings, particulate density, all of them behaving as though nothing had happened, as though the number appearing in the location field was simply a number, not a notation that the Galactic Directorate had spent 200 years treating as a synonym for *absence*. She should file a report. Standard procedure was clear. Instead, she sat very quietly and looked at the coordinates for a long time. Then she reached for the deep scan array, and that was the moment everything changed. Not with fire or alarm or the sound of empire cracking, but with one small woman in a cramped survey vessel, hands trembling slightly, pointing a sensor array at a sector of space that was not supposed to contain anything alive. Her name was Assessor Prime Vane Tala, and she had spent 31 years cataloging the dead. The erase sector had been her specialty because it was considered a safe assignment. Nothing lived there. Nothing had lived there since the Directorate's pacification campaigns 2 centuries prior, when the governance board had made its cleanest and most permanent decision. That certain species, if left unchecked, represented a category of existential threat too unpredictable to contain, too irrational to negotiate with, and too biologically tenacious to simply quarantine. The vote had passed with a 93% majority. The campaign itself had taken only 11 days. Vane Tala had memorized the official record because it was part of her sector orientation. 3rd paragraph, 4th line. The subject species, designated Terran-class biological anomaly, was confirmed eliminated. All 7 primary population centers destroyed. 47 secondary settlements confirmed non-viable. The sector was subsequently surveyed and declared biologically sterile. Case closed. She had always found that last sentence strange. Case closed, as though the Directorate were filing paperwork, as though 200 years ago a civilization had simply become a folder someone placed in a drawer and walked away from. Case closed. Except now her atmospheric sampler was detecting something that organic chemistry databases classified as a byproduct of sustained biological metabolism. Not ancient, not fossilized, not the residue echo of something that had once been alive. Current, active, recent enough that the particulate density suggested a source within 3 light hours of her present position. Vessel intelligence, she said quietly. Cross-reference this reading with known biological signatures in the Directorate database. The vessel's intelligence responded without hesitation. No known species match within the erase sector. Atmospheric composition pattern most closely resembles a pause, processing. Archived signatures from pre-pacification survey records. Classified designation, Terran class. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. That's not possible, Vane Tala said, which was not a scientific statement. It was the kind of thing a person says when the instruments are right and the person is wrong, and they know it, and they haven't accepted it yet. The vessel's intelligence did not argue. It simply held the reading steady on the display, patient as stone. 3 mysteries now lived in the space between Vane Tala and that display. First, how any organism survived what the pacification campaigns were designed to make unsurvivable. Second, why the atmospheric signature matched a species the Directorate had confirmed dead 2 centuries ago, rather than some unclassified organism that merely resembled it. Third and worst, the one she couldn't quite articulate yet, but felt pressing against the edge of her mind like something too large to look at directly. If the case had been closed, if the surveys had been verified, if 11 days of systematic campaign had produced confirmed non-viable results, who had confirmed them? She did not report immediately. This was the first professional failure of Vane Tala's 31-year career, and she would spend considerable time afterward unable to explain it. She told herself she needed more data before filing. She told herself a single atmospheric reading was insufficient cause for alarm. These were not lies precisely, but they were not the truth either. The truth was that something in the smell, in the translated chemical signature of whatever was exhaling into the vacuum near Sector 07, made her feel the specific quality of dread that she associated with discovering something that should have stayed hidden. She pushed the unyielding patience deeper into the sector at minimum drive output. No active scans, passive collection only. Whatever was out there, she did not want it to know she was looking. 6 hours into the drift, the long-range optical array picked up light. Not starlight, not reflected solar radiation from dead rock. Artificial light, warm spectrum, narrowband, the unmistakable fingerprint of directed energy being used for illumination rather than propulsion or communication. It was coming from a moon that the Directorate's charts listed as surveyed, sterile, no designation required. Vane Tala stared at the light signature for a long time. Then she did something she would also struggle to explain. She activated the vessel's audio receiver array and tuned it to the broadband spectrum, the catch-everything setting that no serious surveyor used because it was indiscriminate and produced mostly static. What she got was not static. It was voice. Not Directorate standard, not any registered language in the diplomatic archive. Something she had never heard before, rhythmic, modulated, sometimes rising in pitch in ways that seemed almost excessive, sometimes dropping to near silence before surging again. She didn't understand a syllable of it, but it was unmistakably linguistic, unmistakably intentional, and underneath it, so faint she almost missed it, a second voice responding. 2 of them. At least 2. Vessel intelligence, she whispered, though there was no logical reason to whisper. Analyze the vocal pattern. Cross-reference with archived prepacification Terran linguistic samples. Another pause, longer this time. Confidence level 61%. The phonemic structure shows significant drift from archived samples, consistent with approximately 8 to 12 generations of linguistic evolution, but the base architecture matches. Assessor Prime, the subjects appear to be speaking a descendant language of. Stop, she said. She needed a moment. The Terran-class species, the ones the Directorate had filed under case closed, had not merely survived. They had been alive long enough, generation after generation, in this supposedly sterile sector, to evolve their own language away from what it had been. That was not hiding. That was not a small remnant population clinging to existence in a cave somewhere, waiting to be found. That was a civilization, rebuilding itself in the dark. The question of how tore through her mind, with the force of something structural giving way. The pacification campaigns used total atmospheric denial, a method the Directorate considered the cleanest available because it left no infrastructure damage, no radioactive contamination, no debris field requiring cleanup. It simply rendered every atmosphere in the target system non-viable for the specific biological chemistry of the target species. Precise, species-specific, peer-reviewed across 400 years of application. It had never failed. Until apparently it had. Show me the population center survey records from the original campaign, she said. All of them, every confirmation log. The vessel's intelligence pulled the files. They materialized on her display in neat columns, 47 secondary settlements, 7 primary centers, each with a confirmation timestamp, a surveying vessel designation, and the signature of the certifying officer. She started reading. She was on the 9th file when she noticed it. The confirmation timestamps for settlements 14 through 22, 9 consecutive surveys, were all recorded within the same 40-minute window. The settlements were spread across 3 different moons. At standard survey vessel speeds, even with optimal routing, a physical inspection of all 9 locations would require a minimum of 6 hours. 40 minutes. Either the surveys had been conducted remotely, which the protocol specifically prohibited for pacification confirmations, because remote scanning could not verify biological death with sufficient certainty, or someone had falsified them. Vaintala sat very still. Her training told her what she was looking at. Her career told her what filing this discovery would mean. Her biology told her, in the way that the oldest parts of nervous systems communicate, that she was now in a situation with no safe options, only choices with different kinds of cost. She chose to keep reading. 30 minutes later, she had found 16 anomalous timestamps across the confirmation logs. 16. Not a clerical error, not instrument drift. A pattern deliberate enough that concealing it had required someone to be careful, but not careful enough, or perhaps not expecting anyone to look, because who looked at the survey confirmations for a case that was already closed? Someone 200 years ago had known the campaigns failed, and they had reported otherwise. "You need to eat something." The voice came from the secondary workstation, where Vaintala had, in her initial absorption with the records, entirely forgotten that she was not alone on this vessel. Her research aide, a young technician named Dressen who had been assigned to this survey rotation 4 months ago, and who had never once expressed an opinion that wasn't directly requested, was standing at the nutrition station holding a container of something warm. He was watching her with an expression she recognized as professional concern dressed up as practical suggestion. "I've been eating," she said. "You haven't moved in 9 hours," he said. "And you've overridden 3 automated proximity alerts, which means we're closer to that signal source than survey protocol allows, which means you've decided something, and I would very much like to know what it is before it involves me." She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at the display, then she said, "Sit down, Dressen." He sat. She showed him everything. He was quiet for a while. Then, "The timestamps are forgeries." "Yes." "Which means the campaign confirmation was fraudulent." "Yes." "Which means the Directorate has believed for 2 centuries that the Terran-class species was extinct." He set down the container of food very carefully. "And it wasn't." "No." "And we just found them." "Yes." Another silence, longer than the first. Outside the viewport, the moon with its warm, artificial light sat at a distance of roughly 500,000 kilometers, patient and glowing and completely unaware that it had just become the most dangerous secret in the known galaxy. "What do we do?" Dressen asked. Vaintala had been asking herself the same question for 9 hours. She still didn't have an answer that didn't end with someone catastrophically damaged by the truth. She said the only honest thing she could manage. "I don't know yet, but before we do anything else I want to know who they are now. What they've become. 200 years, Dressen. In the dark, without contact, without resources, without any of the things the Directorate considers necessary for civilizational continuity." She turned back to the display. "I want to know what survived." She moved the unyielding patients to a position behind a debris cluster at 200,000 kilometers and deployed the passive observation drones, each one no larger than a seed, designed to drift rather than navigate, invisible to all but the most paranoid sensor arrays. They took 11 hours to reach the moon's upper atmosphere. During that time, she and Dressen slept in shifts and did not speak much, because both of them understood that what the drones brought back would determine everything that came after. The first footage arrived just before Tala's second sleep cycle. She didn't sleep. The Terrans, because that was what they were. No amount of temporal distance changed the biological confirmation that the drone's passive chemistry readers had already provided. Were not living in caves. They were not hiding in bunkers or sealed environments, or any of the survival configurations that Directorate strategists had, apparently, considered when building their assessment of why the campaign should have worked. They were living in structures that had been built, modified, rebuilt, and built again, layer upon layer of construction that told the story of 2 centuries in geological cross-section. Old walls with new walls built against them. Original foundations hosting structures that had been repurposed so many times their original function was no longer guessable. They had been here, building the entire time. And they were doing something that Tala could not immediately explain, which was the detail that lodged in her mind like a splinter and refused to come loose. On the northern shelf of the primary settlement, the largest one, perhaps 40,000 individuals based on density estimates, there was a structure that had no obvious functional purpose. It was not a shelter, not a food production facility, not a manufacturing center or a power generation node. It was open to the atmosphere on 3 sides, with a roof that appeared to be mostly translucent. Inside, individuals moved in a slow, repetitive pattern that resembled neither labor nor leisure as Directorate Xenobiology classified those categories. They were doing the same motion, over and over with their bodies and their voices, in apparent synchrony. No output was being produced. Nothing was being built or processed or exchanged. They simply moved together and made sound together, and when the sequence concluded, they remained still for a moment before beginning again. Vessel Intelligence cross-referenced this behavior pattern with Directorate Xenobehavioral Archives. No match found. Behavior appears purposeless from a resource allocation standpoint. File it as an anomaly, she said, though she already knew, in the way that 31 years of cataloging dead things sharpens one's sensitivity to things that are alive in unexpected ways. That asterisk purposeless was not the right word. She just didn't have the right word yet. The second misinterpretation had begun, though she wouldn't know it for another 3 days. Dressen found her 6 hours later with a translated text fragment on his display, his face holding the expression of a person who has pulled a thread, and discovered that the thread goes somewhere they cannot see the end of. The linguistic drift model gave us partial comprehension about 4 hours ago, he said. I've been working through the audio captures. What did you get? He put the display in front of her. The translation was fragmentary, whole phrases still reduced to approximations, individual words sometimes rendered as conceptual clusters rather than equivalents, but the core of it was clear enough. She read it twice. This is a historical document, she said. It's a spoken historical document, he said. They were reciting it. That's what the building is. That's what the motion sequence is. They were reciting their history, out loud together, in the open air. The structure with no obvious functional purpose. They do it he checked his notes, every 14 days, based on the frequency pattern in the audio archive, which means they've been doing it for 200 years, which means they've done it approximately 5,000 times, and the text has drifted with each generation, but the structural core hasn't changed. Tala looked at the translated fragment again. It was not a governance document, not a technical record. It began, she translated it herself slowly because she wanted to be certain, with something that rendered approximately as, "We remember the silence. We remember the day the sky stopped being safe. We remember what was taken, and we remember that we did not stop." They built a ritual around the pacification campaign, she said, not a question. They built a civilization around it, Dressen corrected, and his voice was careful in the way that voices get when the speaker is aware that what they're saying is enormous. Tala, The whole settlement structure, the building patterns, the resource allocation, the population distribution, I've been looking at it for 6 hours. It's not organized around survival. It's organized around a specific objective. They're not just living, they're preparing. The word landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. Preparing. For what? She said, though the deeper dread was not the question itself but the realization that crystallized behind it. She had been watching this settlement for 3 days and interpreting everything she saw as a struggling remnant population doing what remnant populations did, surviving, adapting, rebuilding by instinct. The synchronized motion in the open structure had looked like purposeless ritual. The distribution of labor across the settlement had looked like pragmatic resource management. The dense cross-reference construction layers had looked like organic growth without planning. She had been wrong about all of it. Everything she had filed in her preliminary observation notes in the last 72 hours was, she now understood, a misread of something she didn't have the conceptual framework to read correctly. The Terrans weren't organizing around survival. They were using survival as infrastructure for something else entirely. 200 years. 5,000 recitations of the thing that had been done to them. And every structure built, every resource allocated, every generation raised in this supposedly sterile sector had been oriented toward a direction she had not yet identified. "We need to go deeper into the audio archive," she said. "There's something else," Dressen said. He did not sit down, which was unusual for him. He tended to sit when delivering information as a way of signaling that he was being methodical and not alarmed. He remained standing. The drones picked up a signal, not from the settlement, from orbit, low-powered, short duration, cycling on an irregular interval so it doesn't pattern match to standard communication frequencies. She waited. It's been cycling for at least as long as the drones have been in range, which means it started before the drones arrived. He looked at her. They knew we were here before we deployed the drones. The cabin was very quiet. "They've been watching us watch them," she said. "I think," Dressen said slowly, "that the signal is an invitation." She almost didn't respond. Every trained instinct in 31 years of survey work told her to pull the drones, engage the drive at maximum output, and file a full report from a safe distance, while the Directorate decided what to do with 200 years of fraudulent confirmations, and a supposedly extinct species that had apparently been monitoring her vessel since before she deployed passive observation equipment. She composed the report. It took 4 hours. It was thorough and precise, and it contained everything: the timestamps, the atmospheric signature, the population estimates, the behavioral observations, the signal. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened a new channel on the frequency the Terran signal was cycling on, and she sent 3 words in the closest approximation to their language that the translation model could produce. "I hear you." The response came in 40 seconds, which meant they had already written it. It came in Directorate Standard. Not approximated, not translated by an algorithm working from phonemic fragments. Fluent, grammatically precise, with a formal register that indicated the speaker had not merely learned the language but had learned it well enough to choose how to use it. "We have been waiting for someone to look closely enough. You have questions. We have answers. But first, Assessor Prime Vane Tala of Survey Vessel Unyielding Patience, you should know that you are not the first surveyor to find us." Every hair on her body rose. "You are the first one to respond." They came to her. That was not what she had expected. She had imagined, if this moment became real, which she had not truly believed it would, that it would involve her making a decision about approach, about distance, about the appropriate protocol for contact with a species the Directorate officially regarded as a closed file. She had not imagined that the decision would be taken out of her hands entirely, and so graciously, by a single small vessel that emerged from the debris cluster where she had parked the asterisk unyielding patience, and which, she realized with a cold drop in her chest, had been parked in that same debris cluster before she arrived. It held position at 300 meters, close enough for detailed visual, far enough to be out of reflex weapons range. They understood weapons range, another thing to file. The individual who appeared on the communication channel when she opened it was younger than Dressen, possibly, with the physical morphology that the Directorate's old pre-pacification archives had documented in their biological assessments. Bilateral symmetry, 2 primary locomotion limbs, 2 manipulation limbs, a forward-facing sensory cluster on a mobile upper protrusion. The archives had been clinical about it. They had not captured the thing that Vaintala found herself fixating on now, which was the face, the particular quality of expression that moved across it, not one thing at a time, the way Directorate species tended to display emotion sequentially, but multiple things simultaneously, layered and contradicting each other, as though the interior experience was too complex for the exterior to resolve into a single signal. The young Terran was afraid and certain and tired, and something else she had no word for. "You read the confirmation logs," the Terran said, in Directorate Standard, with an accent that was not quite like anything in the linguistic archive. "You found the timestamps." "Yes," Vaintala said. "How long did it take you?" 30 minutes. A pause, something moved through the Terran's expression. They were in the archive for 200 years. "No one looked," she said. "The case was closed." "We know," the Terran's voice was even. "We counted on it." Vaintala's next breath was slower than the one before it. "You knew about the fraudulent confirmations. We created the conditions for them." The cabin went silent enough that she could hear the ventilation system's low hum. Dressen made a small sound that was not quite a word. "That's not," she started and stopped, because she was about to say "not possible," which she had already said once and been wrong. "Explain." The Terran's name, as best Vaintala could transcribe it, was something that the translation model rendered as *Marin*. She was the 18th generation of a lineage, the settlement records designated as the Keeper line, a succession of individuals whose specific role, established by the survivors of the pacification campaign's failure and maintained across every generation since, was to manage the contact protocol. The plan that the original survivors had built not around if the Directorate found them, but around when and around the specific conditions under which discovery could be survived. The falsified confirmations had not been falsified by the Directorate officer whose signature they bore. They had been falsified by the Terrans themselves. Marin explained it in a measured voice that suggested she had explained it before, perhaps rehearsed it, the way the settlement rehearsed their historical record in the open-air structure every 14 days. 12 survivors of the initial campaign had reached the moon in a damaged transport with failing atmospheric systems. They had known the follow-up confirmation surveys would come. They had known that biological confirmation required either physical presence or atmospheric sampling. They had known that the survey vessels would be manned by individuals who had filed hundreds of confirmations and expected nothing unusual. So they had fed the atmospheric samplers exactly what those individuals expected to find. The technical capacity to do that, to fabricate the specific chemical signature of biologically sterile air while living in it, had cost 2 of the 12 survivors their lives. The method they developed had taken 3 weeks of iteration in an environment where every iteration risked the lives of everyone present. They had done it anyway. "You faked your own extinction," Dressen said, and his voice had an edge in it that Vaintala recognized as the sound of someone's conceptual framework breaking and being hastily rebuilt. "You convinced the Directorate's follow-up surveys that the campaign worked." "We needed time," Marin said simply. 200 years. "Yes." Silence again, Then dressin' for what? Marin looked at them through the screen with that layered, unresolvable expression, and she said, to make sure that the next decision the Directorate makes about us is one they cannot walk back. The cold drop in Vane Tala's chest became something heavier and more permanent, because she was beginning to understand, finally, terribly. The understanding arriving not as a single revelation, but as a dozen small pieces clicking together simultaneously, that this conversation was not an accident. The signal Marin's vessel had been broadcasting was not an invitation born from desperation or loneliness or the simple human need to be seen. It was a selection process. They had been choosing her. "How many surveyors found you before me?" she asked. 11, Marin said. "Over 60 years, each of them filed reports." "To the Directorate?" "Yes." And the Directorate, Vane Tala stopped, felt the bottom of something. The Directorate suppressed them. "Every one." Marin's voice remained even, but the thing Vane Tala couldn't name in her expression shifted slightly. The officer who falsified the original confirmations rose very high before he died. His successor understood the problem. There has been a continuous institutional effort for 60 years to ensure that what the original surveys failed to accomplish remained unexamined. 11 surveyors, 11 reports, and Vane Tala had never heard of any of them, which meant either they had been quietly reassigned to positions where inconvenient knowledge could be contained, or something worse, and she was not ready yet to think too carefully about which it was. "Why respond to me?" she asked. "You didn't file the report," Marin said. "Every one of the 11 filed immediately. You held the signal for 9 hours. You read the confirmation logs line by line. You sent 3 words." She paused. "You wanted to understand before you decided what to do. And that matters to you." "We've been building toward a conversation," Marin said. "Not an accusation, not a demand. A conversation with someone inside the Directorate who looks at evidence long enough to see what it actually is." She paused. "We need you to take something back with you, not a report, not a diplomatic message, something the Directorate cannot quietly file and close." Vane Tala thought of the 11 surveyors. She said, "What happened to the ones who reported before me?" Marin looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing happened to the ones who reported," she said carefully. "But you should know, Assessor Prime, that the Directorate's institutional memory is very long, and its tolerance for threats to institutional continuity is very short. If you go back carrying something that makes the case impossible to close again, you will not be comfortable. Your career will end. You may be isolated. You will be watched. And if I don't go back, then we find another surveyor eventually, but they may not have your patience." Marin's expression resolved briefly into something singular and clear. It looked like grief made into purpose. "And we are running out of time for patience." "Why now?" Vane Tala said. "After 200 years, why now?" "Because," Marin said, "we finally have enough." She did not explain what enough meant. Not yet. And the not explaining was itself a kind of answer. Vane Tala understood, a demonstration that after 200 years of building toward a moment in the dark, the Terrans were not going to show everything at once. They had learned from the original 12, from every generation since, from 5,000 recitations of the same remembered wound, the specific and terrible patience of people who could not afford a single mistake. What Marin gave her was not a recording. It was a person. A man named Cole, who was perhaps 60 by the physical markers the Directorate's old biological assessments described, though he moved like someone younger and sat like someone older. He came aboard the unyielding Patience alone, carrying nothing, wearing a garment that showed evidence of long use and careful repair. He did not introduce himself immediately. He sat across from Vane Tala at the small table in the vessel's forward cabin, and looked at her with an expression she had come to identify as the Terran default when processing a new situation, that simultaneous presence of multiple irreconcilable states. and he said, "You want to know what enough means?" "Yes." "Enough means we have 43 settlements across this sector now. Not 47 before you ask. We lost 4 in the early decades." He said it without inflection. The loss was real but categorized, filed in its own column. Enough means we have a population of approximately 2 million. Enough means we have infrastructure that can sustain that population independently of any outside resource for a minimum of 300 years. Vane Tala let those numbers land. Enough, Cole continued, also means we have documentation. Every suppressed report, cross-referenced with internal directorate communications we've gathered through. He paused, methods I won't describe right now. A complete chain of institutional evidence showing that the original campaign's failure was known, that the cover-up was maintained deliberately, that 11 surveyors' findings were suppressed, and that the individuals responsible form a connected institutional lineage that still exists and still holds positions of influence within directorate governance. Dressen made a sound beside her. She understood it. The scope of what Cole was describing was not an accusation. It was a case. A complete, multi-generational, internally cross-referenced case that had been assembled with the kind of careful attention to evidentiary integrity that suggested someone had specifically anticipated the directorate's capacity to dismiss, discredit, or simply ignore anything less airtight. "You've been building a case for 200 years, she said. "We've been building an argument," he corrected. "The case is easy. The directorate knows how to bury a case. We needed something different. We needed the argument that makes burying it more dangerous than hearing it." "What is that argument?" Cole reached into the garment he was wearing and produced a physical object, a small, dense data storage medium of a design she didn't recognize, clearly manufactured in the settlement, not salvaged from pre-campaign technology. He placed it on the table between them. "That object contains the names and current positions of every individual in the directorate governance structure who participated in the suppression, and the specific institutional protocols they used to do it." He looked at her. "It also contains copies of those protocols distributed in a way that means they are no longer solely in our possession." She stared at the object. "If the directorate responds to our existence the way it responded last time," Cole said, "that information becomes public across every independent information network in the known galaxy simultaneously. Not because we release it, because the distribution has already been structured to release automatically if a specific confirmation signal from our settlement stops transmitting." Dead man's switch. The phrase surfaced from somewhere in Vane Tala's old diplomatic theory training. "You've made our destruction into an exposure," she said. "We've made the cost of repeating the decision," Cole said, "higher than the directorate is willing to pay. We are not asking for forgiveness. We are not asking for reparation. We are asking to be left alone, officially and permanently, under a diplomatic status the directorate will have to create because nothing in current governance structure covers a species it has officially confirmed as extinct." "They'll call it a fabrication," Dressen said. "They'll try," Cole said, "but we've had 60 years to study how they suppress the 11 reports. We know which arguments they use in which order, and we know how to pre-answer them. Every anticipated objection has a documented response already distributed. They can try to discredit us, they'll find we've pre-discredited the discrediting." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, something harder and more worn. 200 years is a long time to study the people who want to erase you. Vane Tala took 3 days. She read every document on the storage medium. She cross-referenced every claim against the directorate database sections she had access to, and she found that every cross-reference held. She asked Cole questions for 6 hours on the second day, and for 4 hours on the third, and she found that he answered the questions she asked and waited precisely, and without performance for the questions she didn't ask yet. On the third night, she filed the report. Not the original one she had composed and not sent. A different one. One that began not with the atmospheric signature or the population estimates, but with the timestamps in the confirmation logs and everything that followed from them, structured in the exact order that Cole's documentation suggested would be most difficult to dismiss. Attached to the data storage medium's contents in full, transmitted simultaneously on the standard survey report channel, and 4 independent secondary channels that she had technically violated her access protocols to use. She hit the transmission confirmation and sat very still for a moment afterward. Dressen said, "That's it then." "That's it," she agreed. She was 53 years old. She had a career that was now definitionally over. She had, in the space of 12 days, gone from a surveyor who cataloged the dead to a surveyor who had found 2 million people the galaxy thought didn't exist and handed them, if not safety, if not justice, then at least the next thing, the harder thing, the thing that 200 years of darkness in a sterile sector had been building toward. She looked at Cole, who was still sitting across from her, and she asked the question she had been holding for 3 days. "The building," she said, "the open-sided one, where you recite the history every 14 days, what do you call it?" He was quiet for a moment. "We call it the Memory House," he said. "We built the first one in the 4th year, when it became clear that we were going to survive, but that some of us wouldn't live to see what we were surviving asterisk for asterisk." He looked at the viewport, at the distant glow of the moon they'd come from. "We built it so that the ones who couldn't hold on long enough would know that someone after them would still be speaking their names, still saying out loud what was done and what we chose to do after." Vane Tala thought of the 12 survivors, the 2 who died producing the atmospheric fabrication, the ones who had built the first memory house in the 4th year and understood that the project was generational in a way that would outlast them individually. She thought of 11 surveyors whose reports had been buried. She thought of the case, now transmitted and distributed and structurally unburiable, assembled piece by piece across 2 centuries, by people who had decided that the only thing more dangerous than being found was being found by a galaxy that still thought of them as a closed file. She said, "Do you think it will work?" Cole turned back from the viewport. His expression was, for once, something singular. "We've run the probability models," he said, "extensively. We've stress-tested them against every variable we could identify. We have a very detailed picture of the Directorate's decision calculus." He paused. "But models are built by people who survived, and survival does very specific things to how you see risk. So I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I know that the alternative was silence, and we chose this." The response from the Directorate came 29 hours later. Not to Vane Tala's secondary channels, to all channels simultaneously. An emergency broadcast on Directorate-wide frequency, carrying the authentication markers of the governance board itself. It did not acknowledge the Terrans. It announced an emergency review of pacification campaign confirmation protocols, effective immediately, and the temporary suspension of all survey and enforcement activities in Sector 07 pending completion of a full independent audit. Not an acknowledgement, not an apology, not a diplomatic recognition. A pause. Cole read the broadcast twice, sitting across from Vane Tala in the cramped forward cabin of a survey vessel that had once been the loneliest place she could imagine. He read it in silence. Then he looked up, and for the first time since he had come aboard, his expression resolved into something Vane Tala could actually read. It was not relief. "They blinked," Dressen said, with the slightly stunned tone of someone who had expected this outcome intellectually but not emotionally. "They actually blinked." "They're buying time," Cole said. "They'll try to negotiate terms that minimize acknowledgement. They'll push for a status that gives us protections without forcing them to address the cover-up directly. There will be a very long and very difficult period ahead." "But the case is out," Vane Tala said. "The case is out," he confirmed, "and the dead man's switch is still live and they know it." He set the broadcast transcript down on the table. "They've made the first move that doesn't involve erasure. That's all we needed for now." She looked at him. She looked at the small data medium still sitting between them. She thought about the first memory house, built in the 4th year, when survival was confirmed but victory was not even a defined concept. She thought about 12 people in a failing transport deciding, collectively, in a dark sector the galaxy had written off as sterile, that the project they were beginning would outlast every one of them personally. That the first generation would plant something none of them would live to see flower. That the act of planting was itself the point. She had spent 31 years cataloging the dead. She was beginning to understand that the Terrans had spent 200 years cataloging a different thing entirely. Every small decision, every individual act of endurance, every name of every person who had held the project up for their portion of the carrying before passing it to the next generation. Not because they expected recognition, not because they were certain it would work. Because the memory house was full, and the names kept adding up, and somewhere in that accumulation was something that had no equivalent in any other species' decision-making framework. A species that had looked at 200 years of darkness and decided that darkness was not a reason to stop. It was a reason to get better at building things that could survive it. The Directorate had tried to close the case. The Terrans had spent 200 years making the case impossible to close. Not because they were stronger, not because they had better weapons or superior technology, or any of the advantages that Directorate strategic doctrine recognized as meaningful, but because they had done something that no Directorate strategic model had ever assigned a probability value to, something that fell outside the framework entirely. They had decided in the dark, with 12 people and a failing transport and 2 centuries of silence ahead of them, that the story was not finished. And they had been right. Vaintala's career ended 8 weeks after the transmission. Formally, it was a restructuring. In practice, it was a quiet reassignment to an archival position with no survey access and no external communication privileges. She accepted it without contest. She was allowed to keep her personal correspondence. 6 months later, she received a physical package with no return address. Inside was a small object, ceramic, hand-formed, slightly irregular, clearly not manufactured. It was the shape of nothing she could immediately identify, and it took her 3 days to realize it matched the architectural profile of the memory house as her drones had photographed it. There was a note with it, brief, in Directorate standard, in handwriting she didn't recognize. "We added your name, you should know." She sat at her archival desk in her archival office, holding the small ceramic object, and something happened to her face that she would have been unable to explain to anyone who hadn't spent time watching Terran expressions. Multiple things all at once, none of them resolvable into a single signal. The Directorate would not complete the audit in her lifetime. The negotiations would take decades. The cover-up would be addressed in careful, institutional language designed to minimize accountability while technically acknowledging facts. There would be progress, halting and insufficient, measured in generations rather than years. The Terrans would be patient. They had practiced. And somewhere on a moon in Sector Null 7, in the memory house they had built in the 4th year of their survival, in the wall where they kept the names of the ones who had carried the project before passing it on, her name was now among them. Not as a victor, not as a savior, as someone who had looked at evidence for 9 extra hours before deciding, and in those 9 hours had been the difference between a signal going unanswered and a case that could not be closed. That was all it had taken. That was all it had cost. She didn't know how to feel about that. She suspected she would be working it out for the rest of her life, which was perhaps exactly the point. Because the Terrans had understood from the very beginning something the Directorate had never learned to model, That the most dangerous thing a species can do is make the people trying to erase them need to keep thinking about them long after the decision was supposed to be finished. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the most advanced, the most numerous, the most strategically formidable. They were the species that had been given an ending and had simply, quietly, with enormous patience and enormous cost, refused to be the last page. And somewhere in the known galaxy, in a council chamber where the emergency audit was still in its first phase, and the dead man's switch was still live, and the names in the archive were still multiplying, someone with a great deal of institutional power was learning, slowly, uncomfortably, with the specific dread of someone who has pulled on a thread and found it does not end, what it actually means when a civilization decides that a case is not closed. It means they have been deciding, every 14 days for 200 years, that it isn't. It means they have been building the memory house over and over, in every generation, adding names to a wall that was never meant to be just a record. It was always a promise,